The announcement that shook the Vanderholts. The Vanderholt family was the epitome of old money aristocracy. Their estate, an expansive mansion with towering white columns and glistening chandeliers, stood as a monument to their wealth, built over generations of shrewd business dealings and calculated marriages. Richard Vanderholt, the family patriarch, had expanded their empire in finance and real estate, solidifying their place among the most influential families in the country. He was a man who commanded respect with a single glance, his sharp blue eyes assessing everyone he met as though they were investment opportunities. His presence alone could make a grown man nervous. Beside him was his wife, Eleanor Vanderholt, a woman of refined elegance. She had mastered the silent power of old money, the way a mere arch of her brow could communicate disapproval, how her carefully chosen words could lift or destroy someone's social standing in an instant. She was the guardian of the Vanderholt reputation, ensuring that their family name remained synonymous with prestige and power. And then there was William Vanderholt, their only son, their heir, and the embodiment of everything they had worked to preserve. William had been raised in luxury, attending the most exclusive prep schools, traveling the world before he could legally drink, and rubbing shoulders with the offspring of politicians, CEOs, and royalty. He was the perfect Vanderholt, handsome, well-mannered, and impeccably groomed for a future as the head of the family's empire. For years, his parents had been waiting for the inevitable moment when he would announce his engagement to someone of equal standing. Eleanor had imagined it countless times, her son standing before them, introducing his fiancée, a woman from a powerful lineage, well-bred and polished, someone who would uphold the Vanderholt legacy with dignity. So when William invited them to dinner at an upscale restaurant, they both exchanged knowing glances. "This is it," Eleanor whispered as she adjusted her pearl earrings before stepping out of their town car. "He's going to tell us he's engaged." Richard, ever the pragmatist, smirked. "About time." I was starting to worry he was getting too comfortable with his bachelor life. They assumed he had chosen wisely, perhaps Charlotte Fairmont, the poised and intelligent daughter of a high-ranking judge, or maybe Cecilia Whitmore, heiress to a billion-dollar luxury fashion empire. Either way, the choice would be a smart one. Or so they thought. An unwelcome surprise. The restaurant was private and exclusive, the kind of place where powerful men discussed multi-million-dollar deals over dry-aged steaks and rare wines. William had already arrived and greeted them with his usual charm, pulling out Eleanor's chair and shaking his father's hand with practiced ease. They ordered their meals. Eleanor, a delicately plated fillet of salmon. Richard, a perfectly seared Wagyu steak. And William, his usual ribeye. Once the wine was poured and the pleasantries were exchanged, Eleanor decided to push things forward. "Well, darling," she said with a knowing smile, "you said you had news to share." Richard raised a brow, his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Let's hear it." William set his glass down, took a deep breath, and smiled. "I'm engaged." There it was, the moment they had been waiting for. Eleanor's face lit up with barely contained satisfaction. "Oh, wonderful. And who is the lucky young lady?" William hesitated, just for a second. It was a subtle pause, but Richard caught it. Her name slipped past his lips with quiet confidence. "Emily Carter." Silence. Eleanor blinked. The name meant nothing to her. She ran through every notable family in their social circles, every prominent surname she had encountered at charity galas and elite gatherings. Nothing. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Carter," he repeated. Eleanor cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "Darling, forgive me, but who is Emily Carter?" William's smile never wavered. "She's a teacher." A teacher. The words dropped like a lead weight on the table. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her wine glass. A teacher, not an heiress, not a diplomat's daughter. A teacher. Richard, ever the businessman, kept his expression neutral. "And what does her family do?" William hesitated again. She was raised by her father, Henry Carter. Again, no recognition. Richard took a sip of his wine. And what does he do? William straightened in his chair. He's retired. The silence stretched between them. Eleanor's lips pressed together, but her voice remained soft and measured. Retired from what, dear? William exhaled. He was a factory worker. The final blow. Eleanor's smile froze, her entire body going still. Richard's fingers tapped against the table as if calculating a business loss. They had spent decades ensuring that their son would never have to associate with the lower class, let alone marry into it. And now he was telling them that he was throwing away centuries of aristocratic lineage for the daughter of a factory worker. Richard set his knife down, his gaze piercing through his son. "William," he said slowly, "do you understand what you're doing?" William met his father's eyes without flinching. "Yes, I do." Eleanor forced a tight smile. "I'm sure she's lovely, dear. But marriage isn't just about love. It's about legacy. You have responsibilities, a reputation to uphold." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Mother," William interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Emily is the kindest, most intelligent person I've ever met. She challenges me. She inspires me. She doesn't care about money or power. And that's why I love her." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had spent years molding her son into the perfect heir. But this was not part of the plan. Richard's expression remained unreadable. But then, he leaned forward slightly. "What does she know about our world, William?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with warning. "Do you really think she'll be able to navigate it? To handle the weight of our name?" William's jaw tightened. "She doesn't have to handle anything. We're building our own future." Eleanor nearly dropped her fork. "You're serious. Deadly serious." Richard exhaled through his nose, his fingers steepled together. "And her father?" he asked, carefully neutral. "What does he think of all this?" William smiled, and for the first time that night, there was something almost knowing in his expression. "You'll meet him at the wedding." That was all he said. Richard and Eleanor exchanged glances. They didn't need to say it out loud, but they both knew. This wasn't over. A wedding invitation and a brewing storm. The ride back from the restaurant was quiet, too quiet. Richard Vanderholt sat in the back seat of their chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, staring out the tinted window, his mind working like a finely tuned machine. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the leather armrest, a habit Eleanor knew all too well. It meant he was thinking, calculating, strategizing. Eleanor, sitting beside him, didn't bother hiding her displeasure. She let out a small huff and turned toward her husband. "Well," she asked, crossing her arms, "what are we going to do about this?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the situation settle between them. "This isn't a business deal we can negotiate, Eleanor," he said at last, his voice low and controlled. "William has made up his mind." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "He's throwing away everything we built for him. For a teacher." She practically spat the last word, as if it left a bitter taste in her mouth. Richard sighed. "I don't like it any more than you do, but William isn't a child. He's already made his choice." He turned to his wife, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Now we have to decide how we respond." Eleanor narrowed her gaze. "We could refuse to attend the wedding. Make it clear that this union will never have our blessing." Richard shook his head. "That would only drive him further away. If we cut him off, we lose any influence we have left." "No." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "We attend. We observe. And if things fall apart, we make sure we're there to pick up the pieces." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine," she said curtly, "but don't expect me to pretend to be happy about this." Richard allowed himself the faintest hint of a smirk. "I wouldn't dream of it." The wedding invitation arrives. A week later, a delicate ivory envelope arrived at the Vanderholt estate. The invitation was simple, elegant, but it was missing something. No embossed family crest. No grand venue. No extravagant gold lettering. It was understated, almost humble. Eleanor stared at it, as if it personally offended her. "The ceremony will be held at a vineyard," she murmured, scanning the invitation with a frown. "A vineyard, Richard. Not a cathedral. Not a private club. A vineyard." Richard exhaled through his nose. "At least it isn't a backyard wedding." Eleanor shook her head in disbelief. "Do you know who owns this vineyard?" Richard took the invitation from her, flipping it over. His brow furrowed slightly. "Carter Family Vineyards," he read aloud. "That's her father's name," Eleanor said with distaste. "A factory worker who owns a vineyard," she scoffed. "How quaint." Richard was silent for a moment. He didn't like to make assumptions without facts, and something about this didn't add up. Factory workers didn't just own vineyards, not unless there was more to the story. "Something isn't right," he murmured, running his fingers along the paper. Eleanor didn't seem to hear him. "I suppose we should go, if only to see what kind of disaster William has gotten himself into." Richard nodded absently, still lost in thought. "Yes," he agreed. "We should go." A bitter first meeting. The day of the wedding arrived. The vineyard was breathtaking. Rolling green hills, endless rows of grapevines, and a rustic yet elegant estate at the center. The guests were a mix of Emily's friends, William's acquaintances, and some unfamiliar faces that Richard couldn't quite place. Dressed in her finest designer gown, Eleanor stepped out of the luxury car and immediately scanned the crowd. It didn't take long for her to spot the man she had been dreading. Henry Carter, Emily's father. He was an older man, his face lined with years of hard work, his hair graying at the edges. He didn't wear a tuxedo like the other guests, just a simple but well-tailored suit, as if he had never quite gotten used to formal events. Eleanor's lips curled in quiet disapproval. This was the man whose daughter would carry the Vanderholt name. Henry, however, didn't seem fazed by her presence. In fact, as their eyes met, he smiled and walked toward them. "Mr. and Mrs. Vanderholt," he greeted warmly, extending a strong, calloused hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Richard, ever the businessman, shook his hand with firm pressure, though his expression remained unreadable. Eleanor, however, barely concealed her distaste. "I'd assume you must be Emily's father." Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "That's right." There was something about his presence, something unshaken, unbothered. Eleanor expected awkwardness, insecurity, maybe even gratitude for being in their presence. But Henry Carter stood before them with the quiet confidence of a man who knew something they didn't. It irritated Eleanor immensely. She forced a polite smile. "Your daughter has certainly captured William's heart." Henry nodded, his smile never wavering. "And he's captured hers." Richard, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "You own this vineyard." Henry turned to him, something flashing in his eyes. "Yes, I do." Richard narrowed his gaze. "Strange. William told us you were a factory worker." Henry tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his gaze. "I was, for 25 years." Eleanor's patience was thinning. And then, Henry took a slow breath, glancing around the vineyard. "And then I bought this place." Eleanor scoffed before she could stop herself. A factory worker bought a vineyard. Henry's smile grew wider. "That's right." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "With what money?" Henry chuckled. "With money I earned." There was something in his tone, something knowing, almost teasing. And Richard Vanderholt didn't like it one bit. Before Richard could press further, a voice interrupted them. "Dad." Emily appeared, radiant in her wedding dress, her face lighting up as she approached her father. William was right behind her, looking prouder than ever. "Mr. and Mrs. Vanderholt," Emily greeted warmly, unaware of the tension between them. "I'm so happy you made it." Eleanor forced another smile. "Of course, dear. We wouldn't miss it." But her mind was still spinning. Something wasn't right about Henry Carter, and Eleanor was determined to figure out exactly what it was. A ticking clock and a hidden truth. The wedding begins, but the unease lingers. The vineyard estate was an exquisite sight, bathed in golden sunlight, as guests took their seats under a canopy of lush grapevines. The wooden altar, adorned with white roses and silk drapes, stood at the edge of a breathtaking hill overlooking the valley. The setting was picturesque, yet Richard and Eleanor Vanderholt felt as though they were standing in the midst of something entirely different, an ambush. They had expected a wedding riddled with imperfections, a gathering of ordinary, working-class people who had no understanding of refinement. They had expected their son to regret his choices as he looked upon the life he was about to enter. But none of that was happening. Instead, there was an air of warmth and elegance about everything. The guests, though not of aristocratic status, were well-dressed and carried themselves with confidence. The vineyard estate, which Eleanor had initially dismissed as quaint, now appeared vast and meticulously maintained, as if the Carters had been in possession of wealth they had chosen to keep hidden. Most infuriating of all, William did not look like a man full of regret. He looked happy. Radiantly, undeniably happy. Eleanor sat stiffly in the front row, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She glanced at Richard, who had been unusually quiet since their conversation with Henry Carter. His sharp mind was working, scanning the surroundings, taking in every small detail. Something wasn't adding up. And Richard Vanderholt did not like mysteries. A closer look at Henry Carter. Henry Carter stood near the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the ceremony preparations with a quiet but undeniable presence. His daughter Emily was standing with her bridesmaids, laughing and glowing with anticipation. Richard observed the man carefully. There was something about Henry that didn't fit the image of a simple factory worker turned vineyard owner. His posture, his way of speaking, his self-assured calm, it was as if he was a man who had seen and done far more than he let on. Richard leaned slightly toward Eleanor. "Have you noticed?" Eleanor barely turned her head. "Noticed what?" "Henry Carter. He doesn't act like a man who only recently found wealth." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but he knew she had been thinking the same thing. "Something is off," she whispered. Before Richard could respond, the music shifted, and the ceremony officially began. A ceremony with an underlying game. The moment Emily walked down the aisle, the air shifted. She was stunning in her ivory gown, her golden brown hair cascading in delicate waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were locked on William, who watched her with an intensity that made Eleanor's stomach turn. There was no hesitation in his gaze. No doubt. He was in love. The ceremony progressed smoothly. Vows exchanged, rings placed, the quiet sniffles of teary guests filling the air. Eleanor clenched her hands in her lap, counting down the minutes until it would be over. Then, at last, the officiant spoke. "And now, with the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd erupted in applause. Eleanor forced herself to clap. Richard, however, did not. He was still watching Henry Carter. And Henry Carter was watching him. The reception and the brewing tension. The reception was held inside the vineyard's grand banquet hall, a high-ceilinged space with elegant chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the vineyards. Guests dined at long, beautifully decorated tables, enjoying an assortment of delicacies paired with the vineyard's finest wines. Eleanor sipped from her glass, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "We need to speak with William," she murmured to Richard. Richard nodded. "And I need to learn more about Henry Carter." Before Eleanor could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Vanderholt." They turned to see Henry Carter himself standing beside their table, his smile polite, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "I hope you're enjoying the evening," Henry said smoothly. Eleanor gave him a thin, practiced smile. "It's lovely," she said, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. Richard leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Carter," he began, "I must admit, I'm curious about something." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you built this vineyard after years as a factory worker," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully. "That's quite an impressive leap. I imagine that must have required significant resources." Henry's smile didn't waver. "It did," he said simply. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "And how exactly did you manage that?" There was a flicker of amusement in Henry's expression. He glanced at his daughter Emily across the room, watching her laugh with William, then turned back to Richard and Eleanor. "I'll tell you a secret," Henry said, lowering his voice slightly. "Not everything is as it seems." Richard's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Henry took a sip of his wine, savoring the taste before answering. "You see, my life didn't begin and end in a factory," he said casually. "That was just one chapter." Richard stiffened slightly. "And the other chapters?" Henry chuckled. "Some stories are best saved for the right moment." Eleanor bristled at his evasiveness. "Why so mysterious, Mr. Carter?" Henry met her gaze, his smile never faltering. "Because mystery makes a good story, doesn't it?" Richard didn't like being toyed with. He was used to knowing everything about the people in his social circle. And yet here stood a man he couldn't quite pin down, and that irritated him more than anything. The gift that silenced the room. As the evening progressed, it was time for the giving of gifts. Guests presented William and Emily with extravagant offerings, silverware sets, crystal glasses, handwritten letters of blessing. Then, at last, Henry Carter stood. With a slow, deliberate movement, he placed a velvet box on the table before the newlyweds. The room fell silent. Even Richard and Eleanor sat forward, their curiosity suddenly overriding their distaste. William hesitated, then opened the box. The moment he did, a hush swept through the banquet hall. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Richard's grip tightened around his glass. Inside the box was a deed. A deed to the entire vineyard. Gasps filled the air. Even Emily's hands trembled as she read the document. "Dad, what is this?" she whispered. Henry Carter smiled warmly. "My gift to you, sweetheart," he said. "This vineyard, it's yours now." The room was stunned. Even Richard Vanderholt, a man who had seen and dealt with wealth his entire life, was momentarily speechless. Henry Carter had just handed over an entire estate, something the Vanderholts had spent generations building. And that's when realization struck Richard. Henry Carter wasn't just some former factory worker who had gotten lucky. He was a man of power, a man who had played the long game, a man who had just ensured that his daughter and son-in-law were set for generations to come. And Richard Vanderholt, for the first time in years, found himself at a loss for words. The power shift. A gift that changed everything. The grand banquet hall was frozen in stunned silence. Guests exchanged whispers, their faces painted with disbelief. The deed, an official document embossed with legal seals, sat in William's trembling hands as Emily clutched his arm, her eyes wide with emotion. Henry Carter stood calmly at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet unassuming, like a man who had just set the final piece of an elaborate puzzle in place. Richard Vanderholt, however, remained silent, his calculating mind spinning. A vineyard estate of this scale was no small gift. Even among the wealthiest aristocrats, such a gesture would be unheard of. It wasn't just a display of generosity. It was a move, a statement, a declaration of power. Eleanor, her poise slipping for the first time that evening, leaned toward Richard. This is absurd," she hissed under her breath. "What kind of man simply hands over an estate like this?" Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't know the answer, but he intended to find out. A father's message. Emily, still shaken, turned to her father. "Dad, I don't understand. This vineyard, it's your life's work. How can you just give it away?" Henry smiled gently. "Because it's time," he said. "You and William are the future. This vineyard, this land, should be yours to grow, to cherish. I built this, but I never intended to keep it forever." William looked at Henry with newfound respect, his voice thick with emotion. This is unbelievable. I don't know how to thank you." Henry placed a reassuring hand on William's shoulder. "Love my daughter well. Build something meaningful together. That will be thanks enough." The crowd murmured in admiration. Some guests wiped away tears, but not Richard. Richard was still watching Henry Carter with sharp, unrelenting eyes. Because something wasn't right. This man, this factory worker turned vineyard mogul, wasn't acting like a simple businessman passing on a family enterprise. He was acting like a man executing the final step of a long, calculated plan, a quiet confrontation. As the reception carried on, Richard excused himself from the crowd, his mind racing. He needed answers, and if there was one thing Richard Vanderholt prided himself on, it was his ability to find out the truth. Slipping out onto the terrace, he wasn't surprised when he heard footsteps behind him. Henry Carter. The older man walked up beside him, gazing out over the vineyard, the rolling hills bathed in moonlight. "You have questions," Henry said, his tone mild. Richard chuckled under his breath. "I always do." A pause. Then Henry turned to face him fully. "Go ahead, Richard. Ask what you need to ask." Richard didn't hesitate. "This vineyard," he said, his voice smooth but edged with curiosity. "It was never about wealth for you, was it?" Henry exhaled. A slow, measured breath. "No," he admitted. "It wasn't." Richard crossed his arms. "Then what was it about?" Henry smiled slightly. "Control." The word sent a shiver down Richard's spine. "I was never a man obsessed with status," Henry continued. "I never cared for aristocratic circles or high society games. But power, that is something I understand. And that is something I have played my whole life." Richard's pulse quickened, though his expression remained unreadable. "Tell me, Richard," Henry said, tilting his head slightly. "What do you truly know about me?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "You were a factory worker, then a businessman, and now a vineyard owner." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Richard, that's the story I allowed people to believe. The truth is a little more complicated. The truth about Henry Carter." The air between them grew heavier, charged with something neither man could name. Richard's mind raced. Who was this man? What had he overlooked? "I wasn't just a factory worker," Henry said at last. "I was an investor, a silent force behind businesses no one ever thought twice about. I made my fortune not through wages, but through strategy, buying land before it was valuable, selling businesses before they collapsed, and more importantly, making sure that when I walked away, no one ever realized what I had built." Richard's blood ran cold. This man had played everyone. "You married into old money, Richard," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. "You inherited wealth, expanded it, but you've always existed within a system someone else built. Me? I built my own." Richard clenched his jaw. "Your son, William," Henry continued. "He's a good man, but he never would have been allowed into your world. Not truly. Not unless he married into it. I made sure that when he did, he didn't enter as a man seeking approval from the aristocracy, but as a man holding his own power." Richard felt his grip tighten. This wasn't just about Emily and William. This had never been about just a wedding. Henry Carter had orchestrated an entire generational shift. The Vanderholts, the proud aristocratic family who had ruled their circles for generations, were no longer in control of their own son's legacy. Checkmate. For the first time in decades, Richard Vanderholt felt something he rarely ever did. Defeat. And the worst part, it had been done with grace, with patience, with strategy. Henry Carter had waited, watched, and when the time was right, he had moved his piece across the chessboard and declared checkmate without ever raising his voice. Richard turned to look at him, eyes filled with something between admiration and resentment. "You planned this," he said quietly. Henry smiled. I prepared for it. Richard let out a breath, shaking his head. So what now? Henry patted him on the shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. Now, he said, now we see what they build. And with that, Henry Carter walked away, leaving Richard Vanderholt standing alone in the moonlight. The game had changed, and for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't the one holding the board. The breaking point. A legacy challenge. Richard Vanderholt had spent his entire life building his legacy. He had cultivated wealth, influence, and power, ensuring that his family remained at the top of the aristocratic hierarchy. Yet in a single evening, everything had shifted. The Vanderholt name, once the final word in high society, was no longer the most powerful force in the room. The guests still lingered in the grand banquet hall, sipping fine wine and murmuring among themselves. But the air had changed. No longer were the whispers about Emily's unworthy background. No longer were they about how the Vanderholts would manage the embarrassment of William's choice. Instead, the conversations had shifted. They were about Henry Carter, the unassuming man who had just changed the course of their world. And Richard knew it. Standing off to the side, he watched as guests cautiously approached Henry. Aristocrats, business magnates, and socialites, all people who once dismissed the Carters as beneath them, were now eager to engage him in conversation. It was subtle at first, the polite smile, a casual inquiry. But Richard recognized it for what it was, an attempt to align themselves with the new power in the room. A marriage of equals. William and Emily had retreated to a quieter corner of the ballroom, overwhelmed by the events of the evening. Emily turned to her father. "Dad, you didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice laced with concern. "You didn't have to make such a statement." Henry smiled knowingly. "Yes, I did." William furrowed his brow. "But why?" Henry studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because I love my daughter, and I will never let her enter a world where she is made to feel less than she is." Emily's heart clenched at the quiet strength in his words. William, too, felt the weight of them. He had always assumed he would be the one bringing Emily into his world. He had imagined introducing her to high society, shielding her from judgment, proving to everyone that love mattered more than lineage. But tonight, he realized something. Emily wasn't entering his world. He was entering hers, and her father had just ensured that when he did, he would do so as an equal, not a superior. Eleanor's fear. On the other side of the room, Eleanor Vanderholt clutched her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is a disaster," she murmured to Richard. Her husband said nothing, still staring at Henry. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, but not with anger, with fear. "Do you realize what this means?" she continued. "The power shift, the implications. If William's name is now tied to the Carter estate, if our future grandchildren inherit their fortune alongside ours, then everything we've built could be." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Richard finally turned to look at his wife. "You're afraid," he stated, his voice unreadable. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Aren't you?" Richard didn't answer. Instead, he set his glass down, straightened his posture, and walked toward Henry. Eleanor watched, holding her breath. A tense exchange. The crowd parted slightly as Richard approached, and Henry turned to greet him. "Richard," Henry said, nodding. "Henry." A long pause. Then Richard gestured toward the terrace. "Shall we step outside?" Henry studied him for a moment before nodding. Of course. They walked in silence, leaving the chatter of the ballroom behind. The night air was cool, the vineyard stretching before them, under a sky full of stars. Richard finally spoke. "You knew exactly what you were doing tonight." Henry's expression didn't change. "I did." Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Henry's. "Why?" Henry leaned against the railing. "You already know why." Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You played me." Henry chuckled softly. I protected my daughter. Richard let out a bitter laugh. By making a mockery of my family. By humiliating us in front of our peers. Henry shook his head. No, Richard, I didn't humiliate you. You did that yourself when you dismissed my daughter as unworthy. Richard flinched. Henry continued, his voice calm but firm. You and Eleanor have spent your lives believing that power is inherited. That wealth is a birthright. That status is something granted by lineage, not earned. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. Richard's eyes darkened. And you think you've won? Henry met his gaze without flinching. This was never about winning. It was about changing the game. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Richard didn't know what to say. Because deep down, he knew Henry was right. Eleanor's last attempt. Inside, Eleanor had her own battle to fight. She found Emily near the dessert table, speaking with guests who now regarded her with newfound respect. Eleanor approached cautiously, forcing a smile. Emily, dear, may I have a word? Emily hesitated before nodding. Of course. They stepped aside, and Eleanor wasted no time. I want to start fresh, she said, her voice smooth, controlled. I admit, I may have misjudged you. Emily crossed her arms, skeptical. Did you? Eleanor's smile didn't waver. I only ever wanted the best for William. I hope you understand that. Emily didn't blink. The best for William, or the best for your reputation? Eleanor's smile faltered for just a second. Is it so terrible to want both? Emily's voice was steady. It is if you care more about appearances than people. Eleanor exhaled, regaining her composure. Very well, she said softly. Then let me put it plainly. I see now that you're here to stay. So let's not make things harder than they have to be. A family divided is a weak family. And I do not allow my family to be weak. Emily studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, she smiled. Neither do I. Eleanor blinked. And for the first time that night, she saw it. Emily Carter wasn't just an outsider who had married into the Vanderholt family. She was a force. A woman who wouldn't bow. A woman who wasn't afraid. And suddenly, Eleanor understood. This wasn't just about Henry. This wasn't just about power. This was about legacy. The Vanderholt family would change. Whether Eleanor accepted it or not, the future was already in motion. Emily wasn't an aristocrat. She was something far more dangerous. She was a Carter. And that meant the Vanderholt dynasty would never be the same again. The new era begins. As the night came to an end, Henry Carter and Richard Vanderholt returned from the terrace, re-entering the banquet hall side by side. The air between them was different now. Not friendly, not hostile, but equal. A truce had been reached, spoken or unspoken. The power had shifted, and the future belonged to Emily and William now. They just didn't know it yet. A legacy rewritten. The last toast. As the evening drew to a close, the grand hall of the Vanderholt estate was quieter than before. Guests still mingled in small clusters, but the boisterous laughter and sharp-edged conversations had softened into murmurs. The grand display of aristocracy had been overshadowed by something far more compelling, a shift in power. At the center of it all stood Henry Carter, the man they had underestimated. His presence, once mocked, now commanded silent respect. Emily and William stood by his side, their hands intertwined, unshaken by the events of the evening. They had weathered the storm together, and in doing so, had emerged stronger than ever. Then, Richard Vanderholt did something unexpected. He raised his champagne glass. To family, he said, his voice even. The room hushed as guests turned to watch. A toast after everything. Emily glanced at William, uncertain, but William gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Henry Carter met Richard's gaze. He understood what was happening. This wasn't surrender, it was acceptance. Slowly, Henry lifted his own glass. To family. The room followed suit, crystal glasses clinking together in reluctant agreement. Eleanor Vanderholt, standing beside her husband, remained composed, but her mind was racing. She had spent decades ensuring her family's continued dominance in high society. And yet, in the span of one evening, a man they had dismissed as unworthy had rewritten their legacy, and there was nothing she could do about it. The Vanderholt heirloom. After the toast, Richard approached Henry privately. "Walk with me," he said. The two men strolled down the corridor, away from prying eyes. Oil paintings of Vanderholt ancestors lined the walls, their stern faces frozen in time. Richard came to a stop before a locked cabinet. He pulled a key from his pocket and opened it. Inside sat a velvet-lined box. He removed it, then turned to face Henry. "This has been in my family for generations," Richard said, "passed down from father to son." Henry remained silent as Richard slowly opened the box. Inside was an antique pocket watch, its gold casing worn but polished. An inscription was etched inside the cover: Vanderholt, honor above all. Richard studied the watch for a long moment before extending it to Henry. Henry frowned. "What is this?" Richard exhaled. "It's tradition for the father of the groom to pass this down on his son's wedding day." Henry's breath caught slightly. He hadn't expected this. Richard gave a small, almost bitter smile. "But I'm not the only father in this marriage, am I?" Henry hesitated, then slowly reached for the watch. As their fingers brushed against each other, a silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about respect. Eleanor's final warning. As Henry and Richard returned to the hall, Eleanor intercepted Emily. "My dear," she said smoothly, her voice as poised as ever. "A word?" Emily tilted her head slightly, then nodded. Eleanor led her to a quiet corner, her expression unreadable. "You think you've won tonight?" Emily blinked. "Won?" Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Make no mistake, dear. You may have earned Richard's respect, but the world we live in is not so easily conquered." Emily remained silent, waiting. Eleanor leaned in just slightly. "I've spent decades ensuring my family's place in history. I won't let that change simply because of one night." Emily's lips curled into a small smile. "Then it's a good thing history is rewritten every day." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Emily took a step forward, her voice steady. "I'm not here to destroy the Vanderholt legacy. I'm here to make it better." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the shadows. A new beginning. The evening finally came to an end. As Emily and William walked Henry to his car, the crisp night air felt different, lighter. Henry turned to his daughter and took her hands in his. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. Emily swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I couldn't have done this without you." Henry smiled. "You could have. But I'm glad I was here to see it." William extended his hand. "Mr. Carter." "Henry." Henry looked at him for a moment before shaking his hand. "No more Mr. Carter," Henry said. "Just family." William grinned. "Family." Henry stepped into his car, the antique pocket watch still clutched in his hand. As the engine roared to life, he took one last glance at the grand Vanderholt estate. He had come here as an outsider, but he was leaving as an equal. And that was the greatest gift of all.